Gather round, for I am planning to usurp the throne. That's right, with cunning and cleverness I shall depose the current king and make myself king in his place. Let me outline my evil scheme, gentlemen. In the dead of night, we shall creep into the castle and surround the sleeping king. He'll never suspect a thing, and then quietly, ever so quietly, I shall draw my razor-sharp blade and shave his head. Word conversation, but it must have happened at some point 1,200 years ago. Today, it's the strange story of King Wamba, the king who was overthrown with a haircut. Wamba was a king of the Goths. No, not the folks who like to wear black and listen to The Cure. The original Goths, an early Germanic people known for defeating the Roman Empire in the 4th century. The fall of the Romans marked the beginning of the Middle Ages, and the Western Gothic tribes ruled over much of what is now Spain and France in what's called the Visigothic kingdom. The Visigothic legal system was surprisingly progressive for its time, allowing women to own property and represent themselves in court. Also, if the king of the Visigoths died with no heir, they would elect a new one from their best and worthiest. Enlightened as that sounds, keep in mind that normal people didn't get a vote. This was all done by nobles, bishops, and generals. A weird subsection of this rule was that they had to hold the election in the same place as the previous king died. Well, the legend goes that when the reigning Visigoth king happened to die in a small village called Gertigos, all the bigwigs came to the village to hold their election. One of the people who came was actually a saint, Saint Leo. Leo said he had a vision from God to find a guy named Wamba to be the new king. Here it is important to note that the name Wamba translates as beer belly, and might just be a nickname. So old Saint Leo had declared, "Find the chunky one, a real thick boy. He shall be your king." They found Wamba, a farmer, tilling his fields, and told him, "Hey, you're the king now. Congrats." Wamba said, "No thanks. He would really prefer to be farming." The nobles and saints and bishops continued to pester the old farmer, saying, "Come on, be the king." Fed up, Wamba held up his wooden staff and declared, "I will accept the crown when the dry rod in my hand grows green again, and not till then." This, children, is what we call tempting fate. The legend states that the staff then miraculously sprouted living leaves. God had declared Wamba must become the king. So, a bit embarrassed at being called out by God, Wamba went to the village for the election. Then, in front of the nobles and saints, he tried to refuse the crown again. This guy really did not want to be king. Since the frickin' literal miracle wasn't convincing enough, one of the nobles drew his sword and threatened to behead Wamba if he didn't accept. So, Wamba became king of the Visigoths in 672 AD, and it was presumably quite awkward whenever he had to talk to the guy who threatened to cut his head off. Wamba ruled his kingdom from the walled city of Toledo, which still stands today, and was known as a just and merciful monarch. However, as a medieval king, Wamba had a tough time dealing with rebellions, raiders, and announcing people's birthdays during the dinner and tournament. If the story of how Wamba gained his crown is crazy, the story of how he lost it is weirder. In his royal court, he had a classic evil chancellor, a young noble named Ervig. This up-and-coming Jafar owed his position to Wamba, but it was said that ambition made him forget all favors, and so he came up with a diabolical plan to seize the crown for himself. What was this nefarious scheme? Red wedding? Trial by combat above a waterfall? Herd of stampeding wildebeest? No. He secretly administered the king a potent sleeping potion. And then while the king was knocked out, he snuck in and shaved his head. When everyone saw this, they shrugged and said, "Well, I guess Ervig's the king now." What the heck? Why did that work? Well, the key to Ervig's evil plan was the specific kind of haircut he gave Wamba. If you guys have ever seen Robin Hood, you've probably seen the weird haircut that Friar Tuck has. That's called a tonsure. Traditionally, medieval Catholic monks would shave the top of their heads as a gesture of their devotion to God and their humility. In medieval times, if you saw anyone with a haircut like that, it meant they were a monk. But in fact, it just wasn't that you were a monk, you had to have that haircut. Under Gothic law, if you had that haircut, you had to be a monk. Anyone who was tonsured, that is, had their head shaved in the tonsure style, was condemned to, quote, spend the remainder of his days in seclusion as a monk. So the law was clear. And the plan worked. Wamba woke up the next morning with an extremely unflattering haircut. lost the throne, and Ervig became king in his place. Well, obviously people call shenanigans here. Wamba's hair would grow back, and a lot of people were not especially keen on having a guy who became king via roofie on the throne. A council of the nobles and bishops was called, and they threatened to have Ervig executed for his scheme. Luckily, this story has a somewhat happier ending than most coups d'etats. They asked Wamba to testify about the whole sleeping potion business. But this was the guy who, despite being really good at being king, never wanted it in the first place. Remember in the legend, Wamba had basically been told by God himself to become the king, and had still tried to weasel out. So Wamba sent a letter to the council telling them that, actually, he became a monk because he wanted to. Thank you very much. He officially abdicated the throne, and even recommended Ervig as his successor. The council spent 8 days debating the question. On the one hand, the letter from Wamba might be fake. On the other, he had after all packed his bags and gone to the monastery in a suspiciously cheerful way. In the end, they decided Ervig wanted to be king. Wamba didn't, and the haircut law was pretty clear. Ex-King Wamba spent the rest of his days in peaceful seclusion as a monk. Ervig reigned as king for 7 years before he became seriously ill. He had no son, so to avoid having all the nobles and bishops make yet another council, he proclaimed his own heir, ironically, Wamba's brother-in-law, Ergica. Then, for even more extra special irony, Ervig abdicated the throne and retired to become a monk. The Visigothic kingdom lasted less than 50 years or so after Wamba's death, being conquered in the 8th century by an invasion from Islamic North Africa. However, their legal system, the Visigothic Code, would become the basis of the entire Spanish legal system in the Middle Ages and beyond. Presumably, they have updated the laws a bit, but maybe the current king of Spain might want to make sure he leaves a good tip the next time he goes to Fantastic Sam's.